Professor, you have the floor. Again, 15 minutes. Thank you for coming and for addressing my committee and the public who is here with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just let me elaborate for a moment on how I got involved in the regulatory cooperation challenges of Europe and the United States. In 2002, when I was serving in the White House at the Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Trade Representative and the State Department and the National Security Council came to me and said, "We are in lawsuits with Europe, and we're not solving our problems. Is there some way to get to these issues in the early stages when regulations are being developed so we don't have to try to resolve our issues at the World Trade Organization?" And I'm very pleased that this effort to try to build regulatory cooperation into the process early is an important part of this current discussion of a trade agreement between the U.S. and the European Union. For the benefit of the interpreters, I'm not going to go into the details of my testimony. I'm just going to make a small case study at the start, and then I'm going to give some general ideas about the scope of a possible agreement in this area, and then review some specific recommendations that are in my testimony. The case study I would like everyone to think about is, suppose you are starting a new car company and you would like to market your automobile in Europe and you would like to market it in the United States. Now notice, if the only car companies we had either marketed only in Europe or only in the United States, this would not be an issue. But we're going to talk about an auto company that wants to do both, and everybody in the room knows there are companies, Ford Motor Company, Daimler, Volkswagen, General Motors, that are in this category of companies. So let's think about, and Fiat, of course. Let's think about a few of the ramifications of wanting to offer this automobile on both sides of the Atlantic. You need to find out what the regulations are on the two sides of the Atlantic and make sure that you produce your vehicle in compliance with those regulations. So let's take safety regulation, for example. It's an area of my field as a scholar. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the automobile airbag. It turns out that the European and United States regulators cannot agree on the design of the crash dummy that will sit in the seat in the compliance test. You have to agree on the design of the neck of the dummy and the upper torso, the extremities, how they're going to behave in the crash dynamics. I have sat through years of discussions of technical experts on this. My own view is the European experts have a defensible position. The American experts have a defensible position. And it would be folly to think that someone could know, I know which side is right. The problem is somebody has to tell them that they have to come to an agreement, because it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense not to come to an agreement on the design of the crash dummy. Now, to give you a sense that sometimes I think one side of the Atlantic has a better case than the other side of the Atlantic, I'll give you a second example. If you are this company, you will have to test this car in the United States with a crash dummy that is not wearing a safety belt. By law, you must test it with a dummy that's not wearing a safety belt. In the European Union, this crash dummy will have a safety belt. Now, 30 years ago, when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, the U.S. regulation made some sense. We only had 10% of Americans wearing safety belts. Europe had 70 to 80% at the time. But things have changed, and the United States has adopted many laws, like European laws, that require people to wear safety belts. Usage rates are now above 60% and continuing to rise. Does it really make sense to require these companies to test these vehicles on people who are on dummies who are unbelted? You might say, well, but there are still some people who are not belted. It turns out, however, that when you design an airbag system for an unbelted dummy, you design it differently and not as effectively for a belted occupant. So there are actually safety risks associated with this test of this unbelted dummy. Now, that's an example where I would argue that the European system is better designed for today's conditions, and we should try to move in the direction of the European system. There are other examples where I think we should move in the direction of the European system. But the most important thing is somebody has to be there saying, you have to come to an agreement. Otherwise, there's no pressure on the system to bring any kind of convergence in the process. There is a nice little study that I'll mention of 43 regulations of the auto industry in the European Union and the United States, and it found that only 11 of them were identical. Of the 32 regulations that were different, half of them were minor differences, but half were major differences. And if you were offering a car on both sides of the Atlantic, you'd have to reanalyze the problem on both sides of the Atlantic for those regulations. So I hope that little case study just gives you a flavor for what it's like to try to do business on both sides of the Atlantic and face these different regulatory systems. Now I need to emphasize to you that this is not just the auto industry. I have sat through numerous regulatory discussions with European regulators and American regulators about the chemical industry, about agriculture, about information technology, and very similar themes are present. In a sense, these two regulatory regimes across this vast ocean were developed separately without adequate dialogue, cooperation, and coordination. Now, you will hear some people say that, well, a trade agreement should deal with tariff barriers, not with regulations. And quite frankly, if this agreement is going to be meaningful, it will address more than tariffs. Because most of the issues in trade today are not tariffs. They are, in fact, regulatory differences between the two countries, or regions, I should say. So what are the steps to success in this area? I will give 3 in goals, process, and scope. On goals, ideally, I would love to see harmonization. I'm a college professor. I like to think of the ideal. But sometimes our regulators are never going to get there. So I also kind of like the idea of mutual recognition. It's a kind of mutual respect idea. You know, we recognize that your regulations are different than our regulations, but we respect your process. And products that meet your process will be acceptable in our country and vice versa. But frankly, that's a pretty idealistic idea, and that won't always work. So I also think we should think of the concept of convergence. Convergence is when the two regulatory systems get closer, even though they don't become identical. And it allows for rooms and differences, but it will reduce the amount of work and effort required to develop this car and sell it on both sides of the Atlantic. So the goals are harmonization, mutual recognition, and convergence. And as the previous speakers have mentioned, this process will not be uniform across all sectors of the economy. It will need to be carefully tailored on a sector-by-sector basis and even on a regulation-by-regulation basis. So that's my view on the goals. How about the process? The key point here is there must be centralized political authorities on both sides of the Atlantic who are accountable for progress. We have had years of sectoral dialogues where regulators from individual agencies talk to each other, and in many cases, they have not made progress. If there's not a centralized political authority saying, you must come to resolution by a particular date on a specific schedule, I can assure you, from my own experience in the government, it will not happen. So this centralized political authority, reasonable people can disagree who it should be on both sides of the Atlantic. I'll offer my own opinions, but it has to exist. And then the third is the scope of the agreement on regulatory cooperation. There's a temptation to focus on all of the existing regulations. There's a huge volume of them, but it's very important that we stop the future flow of these inconsistent regulations, the new regulations that are being developed over the next decade. So the scope has to be help on the existing regulations and work on the future regulations. Now here are some of my own opinions on the process questions. In the U.S. government, our trade representatives are buried in issues late in the dispute stage, where they are already almost about to get into a lawsuit or they are in a lawsuit. They are not in the best position to work at the front end of the development of regulatory cooperation. In our government, you need to reach to a different part of the federal government to find these people. They exist in a very obscure office called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at our Office of Management and Budget. and they are key people in the various regulatory agencies. I am not a good enough student of the European governance system to pinpoint where in the European system this accountable political authority to be. My guess would be it would be in the Secretary General's office in the European Commission, but I honestly don't know for sure. But we need to find such a place or create such a place and make sure those people are accountable. Now I would like to move to some observations on the solution that track much more directly my written testimony. I think it's important for people to recognize we're not talking here in most cases about the United States is wrong or Europe is right or vice versa. In most cases, the regulators do have a case for why they want to do the regulation the way they're doing it. So what we need is some pressure on these people to find ways to converge even if they don't become exactly identical. I also want to make clear the point I've already hinted at, that the World Trade Organization is not a solution to this problem. It's not very effective at dispute resolution. It has very weak remedies, even if you win a case in the World Trade Organization. Lawsuits in the World Trade Organization, as I argued in the White House for 5 years, should be considered a last resort when all other efforts at cooperation have failed. In other words, the WTO lawsuit is a sign of a problem, not a sign that a solution is on the horizon. And it's very important that we see that, because the people who are impacted by this process know that the WTO is not the solution to these problems. Now I'd like to make a final comment about the role of the European Parliament and the United States Congress as institutions and how they can be helpful in moving the process of regulatory cooperation forward. I think each year the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress should hold hearings where OMB and the Secretary General's office and regulators and stakeholders are invited to testify on the rate of progress in regulatory cooperation. I think the European Parliament and the Congress should develop scorecards for regulatory cooperation, where we can put numerical scores on specific agencies, specific administrators, how well are they doing on the progress of regulatory cooperation. Each year, these regulators would be invited to testify at how much progress they've made, where they have faced obstacles, where they need help. But this entire dialogue in the United States is not occurring now. No one is asking the executive branch and holding them accountable for regulatory cooperation with the European Union. This agreement has the opportunity to create that kind of accountability, and without the Congress and the Parliament pushing on this issue, I think it is not very likely that we will see dramatic progress. I'm also very encouraged that the European Parliament has a relatively new impact assessment unit, and I think it could also play a constructive role by prodding the European Commission to engage in more collaboration with the United States, not only in the guidance around regulatory impact assessment, but actually in collaborating on specific regulatory impact assessments for key regulations. They could, for example, publish illustrations of how regulatory impact assessments on the two sides of the Atlantic have been improved or could be improved, and how they can be harmonized or reach a degree of convergence. These models of successful regulatory cooperation could then be documented and publicized by the European Parliament and by the Congress, thereby providing motivation and morale for people in the various agencies to improve their practices. So I am, in conclusion, delighted that we are here today to talk about this issue. It is not an easy one. And people who say we're just going to tweak a few technical regulations and nothing else will be affected, they don't understand the complexity of these issues. Okay, it is going to take a long time, and it's a big investment of energy, but it's worth it. There's no real reason you shouldn't design these vehicles and sell them on both sides of the Atlantic and respect each other's regulatory system. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you very much indeed.